The sterling tower glittered like a monument to ambition, its glass walls gleaming against the velvet of the evening sky. The corporate gala had been the talk of the city for weeks, a celebration of success hosted by Sterling Innovations, the tech empire that had turned dreams into data, and its young CEO, Isabella Lane, into a global icon of brilliance and drive. Inside the ballroom, the air shimmered with laughter, perfume, and the faint sparkle of champagne bubbles rising in crystal flutes. The sound of a jazz quartet blended seamlessly with the murmur of conversation as powerful men and women drifted through the crowd, trading smiles that masked decades of competition and secrets. At the far end of the marble corridor, separated by a single service door, Jack Turner was polishing the silver handrails of the staircase leading to the ballroom. His reflection flickered in the mirrored surface. Tired eyes, a strong jaw darkened by stubble, and a quiet focus that came only from years of learning to stay unnoticed. He was part of the maintenance crew hired for the night, a janitor in a crisp but cheap uniform that carried the faint smell of detergent. He worked with precision, almost military discipline, every motion purposeful and silent. Few noticed him, and that was exactly how Jack preferred it. Down the hall, perched on a bench with her little backpack beside her, sat Ella Turner, his 9-year-old daughter. She swung her legs rhythmically, humming a tune as she colored in a notebook filled with stars, rockets, and superheroes. Every few minutes she looked up, eyes searching for her father, and each time he glanced back and gave her a small, reassuring nod. She smiled, a small, pure thing that cut through the polished indifference of the corporate tower. "Daddy, are you almost done?" she called softly, careful not to disturb anyone who might be passing by. "Almost, sweetheart," Jack replied, his voice calm and warm. "Then we'll stop for pizza on the way home. Extra cheese, remember?" Her eyes lit up with the joy only children could summon from something so simple. "Promise?" "Promise," he said and smiled. But as his fingers resumed their steady motion, his thumb brushed unconsciously over a worn silver ring on his right hand. Its surface was scratched, but faint markings, numbers and letters arranged in a cryptic code, were still visible under the ballroom's lights. He turned it once, twice, as if the habit itself anchored him. No one in this building knew what that ring meant. To them it was a cheap trinket, but to Jack, it was the last remnant of another life, a life that had ended long before the world began calling him the janitor. Upstairs, Isabella Lane moved through the glittering crowd with the poise of a woman who had built her empire from pure willpower. At 30, she was the youngest CEO ever to take Sterling Innovations public, and tonight was supposed to mark another milestone: the launch of a humanitarian AI initiative designed to revolutionize education for underprivileged communities. Her public smile was immaculate, trained, but behind her calm surface lay exhaustion and unease. For the past 3 weeks she had received anonymous messages, short, precise, and personal. "We know what you did. You can't hide it forever. Payment due." They arrived through encrypted channels from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her private security had found nothing. The police had dismissed them as empty threats. But Isabella wasn't convinced. She had lived her life building things, companies, reputations, walls, and she could feel when something dangerous was moving beneath the surface. "Miss Lane, the investors from New York just arrived," her assistant whispered, clutching a tablet close to her chest. "And the head of security confirmed the perimeter is secure." "Good," Isabella murmured, but her eyes continued to scan the room. "Keep your phone on you." "Yes, ma'am." Isabella's gaze drifted across the ballroom to the double doors where guests were still arriving. She caught sight of 3 men in black suits entering quietly. They didn't move like investors. They didn't smile or shake hands. Their steps were deliberate, their gazes sharp and unblinking, scanning exits, corners, and sightlines instead of people. A chill prickled down Isabella's neck, and for a moment, she felt the air in the ballroom shift, like the stillness before a storm. Downstairs, Jack had just finished polishing the last handrail when his instincts stirred. It was faint at first, a sound too controlled, too synchronized. He looked up toward the service stairwell leading to the ballroom and caught a glimpse of movement through the gap in the door. 3 men, professional posture, sharp eyes. He recognized it instantly. The way they scanned the room, the placement of their hands near their jackets, the coordination of their formation. Not random. These were not bodyguards or corporate security. These were men trained to move as a unit. Predators. He exhaled slowly. For 16 years he had buried the part of himself that could read danger the way others read words. He was no longer Captain Jack Turner of the Recon Division. He was a janitor, a single dad who fixed leaky pipes and cleaned up after people who didn't know his name. Yet as his heart rate steadied and his senses sharpened, the years seemed to fall away. Training never left you. It only slept. Ella tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, can I have some juice?" "Stay right here, baby," he said softly, brushing her hair back. "I'll be right back. Don't move, okay?" She nodded, trusting him completely. Jack rose, pushing the cleaning cart to the side, his mind already working through calculations. There were 2 main exits from the ballroom, both monitored by Sterling's in-house guards. But those guards were not ready for real threats. He had seen that kind of confidence before, the kind that came from never having faced actual danger. Upstairs, the party was in full swing. The vice president of Sterling raised a glass, delivering a speech about innovation and hope. The crowd applauded politely, glasses clinking, laughter echoing again. The 3 men in suits had spread out now, positioning themselves like wolves closing in on a cornered deer. Isabella felt her chest tighten, her smile falter for the briefest second. She took a slow step backward, pretending to reach for a drink. Her assistant noticed. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "Something's wrong," Isabella whispered. "Those men, do you see them?" The assistant followed her gaze, her face paling. "They're not on the guest list." Isabella's phone buzzed in her hand. She glanced down. The message was only 3 words, but it froze her blood. "They're here for you." For a heartbeat, the entire room seemed to go silent. Isabella's mind raced. She had prepared for negotiations, for press, even for corporate sabotage, but not this. Not something that looked like a scene from her nightmares. Her assistant's voice quivered. "Should I call security?" Before Isabella could answer, the grand doors burst open. Every head turned as the sound of polished shoes echoed sharply against the marble floor. The music stopped. The jazz players froze mid-note. The 3 men advanced, unhurried but unstoppable, their expressions carved from stone. Whispers rippled through the crowd like electricity. "Who are they? What's happening?" Isabella's chest tightened as one of the men reached beneath his jacket, not to draw a weapon yet, but enough for everyone to see the outline of one. The crowd gasped. A woman screamed. Jack, from the balcony above the service entrance, saw it all. His world slowed into that strange clarity that only came in moments of crisis. Every instinct screamed at him to stay out of it, to protect his daughter, to walk away. But the same voice that had guided him through years of combat whispered another truth. If he did nothing, people would die. Below, one of the men stepped forward, voice low but cutting through the murmurs like a blade. "Miss Lane, you're coming with us quietly." Isabella's face drained of color. I don't understand." The man leaned in closer, his tone turning venomous. "You understand perfectly. Our employer doesn't like to be kept waiting. You have something that belongs to him." Jack's jaw tightened. His gaze locked on the man's hands, his stance, his escape route. Without realizing it, his thumb twisted the silver ring again, pressing the worn edges into his skin like an old ritual. 16 years since he'd taken orders. 12 years since his last operation. 8 years since he'd buried that life forever and become a ghost with a mop. But war didn't erase itself. It just waited. He turned toward the service door, his movements calm, almost casual. But inside, his pulse was cold and steady. He didn't need a weapon. He had his training, his awareness, his precision. He glanced once at the alcove where Ella sat hidden behind the cleaning cart. Her wide eyes followed him, confused, trusting. He gave her a faint nod, the same silent signal he once gave his team before a dangerous entry. Then Jack Turner, the invisible janitor, pushed open the service door and stepped into the golden light of the ballroom. Every step echoed, every head turned. To the glittering crowd, he was just the janitor they had ignored moments ago. To the 3 men, he was a variable they hadn't planned for. To Isabella, he was a stranger walking calmly into the heart of danger. But to anyone who had ever known what true control looked like, the stillness before violence, there was something unmistakable about the way he moved. The lead man turned, irritated. "Sir, this doesn't concern you." "Step back." Jack's voice was low even. "It concerns me now." And in that moment, 15 seconds that stretched into eternity, The air in the ballroom seemed to freeze. The man, they forgot. The ballroom's shimmering energy had fractured into silence. The kind of silence that carries tension so sharp it hums under the skin. Crystal glasses sat half raised, forgotten in trembling hands. The once smooth music had died mid-note, leaving only the faint echo of the grand doors that had slammed shut behind the three intruders. In that frozen tableau, every eye in the room found the same unexpected figure. The janitor, stepping forward from the service corridor, his face unreadable, his movement calm but deliberate. Jack Turner had always been invisible, the kind of man people looked through, not at. Tonight, for the first time, the crowd saw him, but they didn't understand what they were looking at. The lead man, tall with a scar slicing faintly across his cheekbone, fixed his gaze on Jack with mild irritation. I said, "Step back. You're out of your depth, friend." His tone was casual but edged with the confidence of someone used to being obeyed. The other two men shifted slightly, their formation tightening without any overt signal. That simple motion told Jack everything he needed to know. They were trained professionals, likely private operatives, not random thugs. The way they stood, angled for clear lines of sight, hands always near their weapons, was unmistakable. Jack kept walking, closing the distance between himself and the center of the ballroom, where Isabella Lane now stood pale and still, her pulse visibly fluttering at her throat. The crowd's collective fear was a living thing, pressing down on the air like weight. "Miss Lane," Jack said quietly, his eyes not leaving the men. "I think you should step back." Slowly. Isabella blinked, her mind struggling to catch up with the absurdity of the moment. "Who are you?" she whispered, voice trembling. "Maintenance," Jack replied simply, his tone steady as stone. Then, as though he were asking about a spilled drink instead of a life-threatening situation, he added, "And you might want to keep your head low." The scarred man gave a faint smirk, stepping toward Jack. "You've got some nerve, janitor. Do yourself a favor and stay out of this before you end up cleaning your own blood off the floor." The threat rolled through the air, but Jack's expression didn't change. He had heard worse from men far more dangerous than these. He measured their spacing, 2 meters apart, 3 lines of fire, minimal collateral if handled fast. He felt the old instincts flicker to life, the battle map forming in his mind without conscious thought. He had promised himself never to be this person again, never to let that world touch his daughters. But he also knew that inaction had a price. Isabella's assistant had already fumbled her phone out, whispering frantically into it, "Security! We need help now." But Jack knew it wouldn't matter. The security team at the door were ex-military perhaps, or retired law enforcement, but they were out of position. These three were closer, faster, and armed. "Last warning," the scarred man said, stepping even closer. "Move." Jack's voice dropped, calm as a whisper. "You should leave while you still can." The man laughed. "Or what? You'll mop us to death." The laughter rippled through a few corners of the crowd, nervous, forced, but it died the instant Jack moved. He didn't strike the way people in movies did. There was no flourish, no telegraphed motion. He simply stepped inside the man's reach, caught the attacker's wrist as it went for the weapon, twisted sharply and used the momentum to drive him to the ground. The move was efficient, practiced, and brutally effective. The sound of a bone snapping echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. The man's cry was cut short by the metallic clatter of his pistol sliding across the marble floor. Gasps rippled through the crowd, shock freezing every onlooker. The second man lunged, but Jack was already moving. A sidestep, a strike to the elbow, and a quick pivot sent the man sprawling into a decorative pillar. The entire confrontation lasted less than 10 seconds, but it changed everything. The crowd that had mocked him hours ago, the same executives who had watched him clean spilled drinks, now stared at him as though they were seeing a ghost from a story they had never believed. Isabella stood frozen, her lips parted in disbelief. The quiet janitor she had barely noticed, who had endured humiliation at the hands of her guests, had just dismantled 2 armed professionals in under half a minute. The third man had drawn his weapon now, hand steady, eyes blazing. The muzzle pointed straight at Jack's chest. "Don't," Jack said evenly, his voice carrying across the marble floor like a command, not a plea. "You don't want to do this." "Back off," the man snarled. "You've got no idea who we work for." Jack's gaze didn't waver. "You're right, but I know exactly what kind of men you are." His tone was low, almost regretful. and I know what happens next if you make the wrong choice." For a moment, everything hung in delicate balance: the trembling air, the terrified silence of the guests, the glint of the gun under the chandeliers. And then from the side of the ballroom came a small sound. "Daddy?" Every head turned. Ella stood near the service entrance, clutching her coloring book against her chest. Her wide eyes glistened with confusion and fear. Jack's heart clenched and a single breath escaped him. Controlled but pained. "Sweetheart, go back, now." His voice was still calm, but there was steel under it. The armed man noticed her too, and a cold smile crept across his face. "So that's what's keeping you brave." He shifted the gun slightly, angling it toward the child. That was his final mistake. Jack moved before anyone saw him move. One instant he was 3 steps away. The next the weapon was spinning through the air, clattering harmlessly across the marble. Jack slammed the man against the nearest column, pinning him with a forearm to the throat. His voice dropped to something quiet and terrifyingly calm. "You point a gun near a child again, and I promise you'll never hold one in your life." The man struggled, but Jack's strength was implacable, forged in years of survival and regret. He released him finally, letting him collapse to the floor, gasping for breath. The ballroom erupted in noise now, security rushing in, guests shouting, phones recording. But amid the chaos, Isabella stood motionless, staring at Jack. There was something in his eyes she recognized, not just skill or danger, but the heavy loneliness of someone who had lost too much. He turned away from her gaze, scanning the room to ensure there were no more threats, then crouched to pick up Ella, who ran into his arms and buried her face against his chest. He held her close, whispering something only she could hear. When the security team finally surrounded them, weapons drawn, Jack raised his hands slowly. "They're down," he said. "No one else is hurt." The head of security, a broad man with a rigid stance, glared at him. "Who the hell are you?" "Maintenance," Jack said again. His tone carried no sarcasm, just quiet finality. "You might want to check the IDs on your guests before the next event." Isabella stepped forward then, her heels clicking softly against the floor. The crowd parted for her instinctively. "Wait," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Let him speak." The security chief hesitated, then nodded. Jack exhaled slowly, setting Ella gently down beside him. The child clung to his hand, her trust unwavering despite the chaos. Isabella's gaze flicked from him to the unconscious intruders and back. "You knew what they were," she said. "Before anyone else." Jack hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I've seen their kind before. Overseas a lifetime ago." "You were military," she guessed once, he admitted. "A long time ago. And now you mop floors in my building?" He gave a faint smile. "It's honest work. Keeps my daughter fed." There was something in his simplicity that disarmed her more than any weapon could have. Around them, guests were whispering, speculating, realizing the quiet man they had laughed at was someone extraordinary. Jack didn't look at them. His focus was entirely on his daughter, brushing her hair back, murmuring softly that everything was all right. Isabella watched them, her mind racing. She felt a sting of shame for every dismissive glance, every unspoken assumption. This man had risked his life tonight without hesitation, and not for glory, not for reward, but because it was the right thing to do. And somewhere deep inside, a thought took root. A recognition that true strength didn't come from status or wealth, but from character. As the paramedics arrived and the police began to question the unconscious attackers, Isabella found herself standing beside Jack again. "They were here for me," she admitted quietly. "Someone I crossed." "Someone powerful." "I don't even know how you saw it coming." Jack didn't meet her eyes. People like that always move the same way. Doesn't matter who they work for. He paused, then added, "You'll want to tighten your security. They'll try again." "Then maybe you should stay on," Isabella said impulsively, as more than maintenance. Jack glanced at her, the faintest shadow of amusement crossing his face. "I don't think your board would approve of a janitor on your protection detail." "I think," Isabella replied, her tone soft but firm, "my board will approve of anyone who saved my life." For the first time that night, Jack didn't have an immediate answer. He simply looked at his daughter, then at the glittering skyline beyond the glass walls, the city stretching endless and indifferent. The life he had built was small but peaceful, safe from the ghosts of his past. Yet standing there amid the wreckage of arrogance and fear, he realized something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Ella tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, are we still getting pizza?" He smiled down at her, a real smile this time. "Yeah, sweetheart. Extra cheese." Then he turned back to Isabella. "We'll talk tomorrow." And as he led his daughter out through the quiet corridors of Sterling Tower, the crowd that had once ignored him stepped aside in silence, watching the man who had reminded them what true courage looked like. Behind him, Isabella Lane stood by the shattered calm of her ballroom, her mind echoing with the words he'd said and the calm in his voice. "It concerns me now." For the first time in years, she felt something she couldn't quantify with data or strategy, faith in someone other than herself. Outside, the city lights burned bright against the night, and somewhere deep within its endless maze, new ripples of consequence began to move. Because men like Jack Turner didn't just save lives, they changed them. The hidden past. The next few days passed with a tension that felt like the slow tightening of a string about to snap. Jack continued his work at the skyscraper, blending once again into the background of clattering trolleys and murmured conversations. But something had changed, an invisible shift that rippled through the marble corridors and glass elevators. Word had quietly spread about the night he saved Isabella Lane. People looked at him differently now. Some with gratitude, some with curiosity, and others with quiet resentment. He was no longer invisible, yet Jack wore his silence like armor. He didn't want attention. Attention brought questions, and questions had a way of unearthing things best left buried. Isabella had fully recovered by now, though she still carried the shadow of that night in her eyes. She had tried to thank him privately, offering him money, a new position, even a house, but Jack had refused it all with quiet dignity. "You don't owe me anything, ma'am," he said simply. "You just take care of yourself." That humility only made her more curious. Who was this man who turned down the kind of offer most people would dream of? A janitor who fought like a trained operative, who vanished after saving a life and went back to scrubbing floors as if nothing had happened. She'd seen men like him once before, but never outside classified files, so she began to look into him, discreetly. She asked HR for his file, but it was frustratingly thin. No address beyond a rented apartment in an old neighborhood, no family listed, no emergency contact. The employment history was patchy, gaps of years between jobs and one faint note that caught her eye. Prior employment unverifiable. Documentation lost in transition. She frowned at that line. It was the kind of bureaucratic fog that hid things intentionally. She closed the file slowly, a chill of intrigue running down her spine. There was more to Jack Turner than anyone knew. Meanwhile, Jack's quiet life with Ella continued. Each morning he woke her before sunrise, cooked her oatmeal, and walked her to the small public school 3 blocks from their apartment. They didn't have much, but their little routines were sacred. Morning smiles, stories at bedtime, and drawings she left for him on the kitchen table. To Ella, her father was her whole world. She didn't know what he carried in his heart. The guilt, the grief, the scars of a past he could never speak of. When she asked once about her mother, Jack's face had tightened ever so slightly before softening again. "She was brave," he had whispered. "Just like you." And that was all he ever said, but ghosts never stay buried for long. One evening, as he left work late, Jack noticed something unusual. A black sedan parked across the street from the tower's side entrance. The same car had been there 2 nights in a row, engine idling, headlights off. When he turned to look, the silhouette of a man inside quickly averted his face. Jack's instincts, honed from a life he no longer claimed, told him he was being watched. He adjusted his pace, blending into the shadows, circling the block and taking a long route home. When he arrived, he found nothing disturbed, but the unease followed him through the night like a whisper he couldn't silence. The next day, Isabella called him to her office. It was the first time she'd done so since the night of the fire. She looked composed, but there was a different kind of intensity in her eyes, an urgency she tried to mask behind her professional tone. "Jack," she began softly, "I owe you my life and I respect your privacy, but I need to understand something. Who taught you to fight like that?" Jack's jaw tightened. For a long moment he didn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, Some things aren't meant to be revisited, Miss Lane. His eyes carried that distant look of someone who'd seen too much. She leaned forward slightly. You're not just a janitor, are you? He met her gaze without flinching. Does it matter what I was, ma'am? I'm just trying to live quietly now. The finality in his tone should have ended the conversation, but Isabella felt something more. A strange sense of guilt, maybe even admiration. You saved me, she said, her voice breaking slightly. The least I can do is make sure no one hurts you. Jack blinked, surprised. Why would anyone want to hurt me? Isabella hesitated. Because someone's been asking questions about you. People outside the company. The words hung heavy in the air. Jack felt the room tilt slightly, his pulse quickening. Outside the company. That meant whoever they weren't journalists or corporate rivals. He had seen this pattern before. Men who moved in silence with files that didn't exist, using names that changed like smoke. He took a slow breath. If they come again, he said quietly, you must stay away. Don't involve yourself in this. That night, as rain lashed against the apartment window, Jack sat by the table while Ella slept. The dim light from the street cast long shadows across the floor, and he stared at the old photograph he kept hidden in his wallet. It was faded now, the edges frayed, showing a younger version of himself in military gear beside a woman in uniform. Her smile was radiant, her hand resting on his shoulder. Behind them, a helicopter blurred in motion, dust rising in waves. We made it, the caption on the back read, written in her handwriting. His fingers trembled slightly as he traced the letters. She hadn't made it home. Neither had most of his unit. And when the government buried the truth under classified reports, Jack had buried himself with it. The next morning, when he stepped out with Ella, he noticed it again, the black sedan parked farther down the street. This time, he didn't pretend not to see it. He bent down, kissed Ella on the forehead, and said, I'll pick you up early today, okay? She nodded, her backpack bouncing as she ran off toward the school gates. Jack waited until she disappeared inside before turning back toward the car. Slowly, deliberately, he walked toward it. The tinted window rolled down halfway, and a man with sharp features and cold eyes met his gaze. It's been a long time, Captain Turner, the man said. The title hit him like a blade to the chest. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. Jack's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. You have the wrong man. The stranger smirked. No, you're exactly the man we've been looking for. And in that moment, Jack realized the quiet life he had built was about to unravel. The past he had fought so hard to bury was clawing its way back, and this time it wouldn't stop at his door. It would come for everything he loved, including the only person he couldn't afford to lose. The world seemed to narrow to the space between Jack Turner and the man in the black sedan. The street was quiet, the morning traffic still distant, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Jack's face remained calm, almost unreadable, but inside his mind had shifted into an old rhythm he thought he had left behind. A rhythm of calculation, of threat assessment, of quiet readiness. The man behind the glass smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You can relax, he said, voice steady, practiced. I'm not here to make trouble. Not yet. He handed Jack a small envelope through the cracked window. Consider this a courtesy. We'll talk soon. Then the window slid up, the engine hummed, and the car pulled away, disappearing into the morning traffic before Jack could even decide whether to follow or vanish. He stood there for a long moment, the envelope heavy in his hand. He didn't need to open it to know what it contained. People like that didn't send letters. They sent warnings. But still, curiosity, or maybe resignation, got the better of him. He tore the flap and found a single photo and a small folded note. The photo was of Ella, taken from a distance as she played in the schoolyard. The note was simple. We know what you left unfinished. You can't hide forever. His fingers clenched around the paper until it crumpled, and for the first time in years, the quiet fury he'd buried deep inside began to wake. That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He sat on the couch staring at the darkened window, listening to the city's restless hum. Every creak of the building made him tense. Every car passing below drew his attention. The instincts of an old soldier refused to die. He knew how this game worked. If they had found him, they wouldn't stop at surveillance. They'd start pushing, probing, using leverage, and leverage meant Ella. That thought alone turned his fear into cold determination. He couldn't let them touch her. Not again. Not after everything he had already lost. The next morning he went to work as usual, pretending nothing was wrong. But Isabella noticed the change immediately. There was something in his posture. Sharper, more alert, like a predator waiting for movement. She didn't say anything at first, but as the day dragged on, her curiosity got the better of her. When she found him in the service corridor that afternoon, mopping quietly near the loading dock, she stepped forward and said softly, "They came for you, didn't they?" Jack froze, then turned to face her, expression unreadable. "You shouldn't concern yourself with this, Miss Lane." Her gaze hardened. "If it puts my company, my people, or you in danger, I will concern myself." For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Then Jack sighed, setting the mop aside. "I wasn't always a janitor," he said finally, his voice carrying a weary weight. "I served in special operations, classified missions overseas. One of them went wrong, very wrong. I lost my team, and the people behind it needed someone to blame. I walked away before they could bury me with the rest." Isabella's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. "I thought it was over," Jack continued. "But it seems they still have unfinished business. They want something from me. What could they possibly want after all this time?" she asked, her tone softer now, the authority giving way to empathy. Jack looked past her, his eyes distant. "A file. Something I took before I disappeared. It wasn't supposed to exist. Proof that the mission wasn't an accident. Proof that they sacrificed civilians to cover their tracks. I kept it as insurance, but I buried it deep and I never wanted to see it again." Isabella took a step closer. "If that file can expose them, you can't keep running. You could stop them." Jack shook his head slowly. "You don't understand. These people aren't politicians or generals you can drag into a courtroom. They own the courtroom. They decide who speaks and who disappears." His words were low, deliberate. "The moment I go public, Ella's life is a bargaining chip." Silence filled the narrow corridor, broken only by the hum of distant machinery. Isabella's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him he was wrong, that justice still existed, but something in his eyes stopped her. There was no defiance there, only experience. Hard-earned, brutal experience. Finally, she said, "Then we find another way. I've dealt with men like that in business, though never at your level. They make mistakes when they think they're untouchable. If you trust me, maybe we can outplay them." Jack almost smiled, a sad, fleeting thing. "You're braver than most," he murmured, "but you don't know how deep this goes." The rest of the day passed in a haze. Jack kept to himself, watching the exits, the corridors, the unfamiliar faces that lingered too long. When he left work that evening, he took Ella straight home. But when they reached their apartment, he noticed something subtle but unmistakable. The lock on the door had been tampered with. It was minute, barely visible to anyone else, but Jack saw it instantly. He motioned for Ella to stay behind him, his voice calm though his pulse had spiked. "Sweetheart, go next door and ask Mrs. Diaz if you can borrow her phone, okay?" She frowned, sensing something wrong, but obeyed. The moment she was gone, Jack drew the small folding knife he kept in his pocket and pushed the door open. The apartment was quiet, too quiet. He moved slowly, each step measured, his senses heightened. The air smelled faintly of aftershave, one he didn't own. He scanned the living room, then the kitchen, his eyes darting to the faint reflection on the microwave. Movement. Behind him. He pivoted fast, grabbing the figure by the collar and slamming him against the wall. It was a man in his 30s, dressed in plain clothes but carrying the rigid posture of someone trained. The intruder didn't fight back. He simply smiled through the pressure on his throat. "Still sharp as ever, Captain," he rasped. "They'll be pleased to know that." Jack's grip tightened. "You've got 5 seconds to tell me who sent you before I break something you'll miss." The man's smirk faltered slightly. "You already know who, they just want the file. Bring it to the old docks tomorrow at midnight and no one gets hurt." Jack's eyes darkened. "If they touch my daughter—" "They won't," the man interrupted. though his voice trembled now. Not if you cooperate. Jack held him there for another moment, then released him abruptly. Get out, he said coldly. The man straightened his collar, gave a mocking salute, and left without another word. When Ella returned a few minutes later, Jack was sitting at the table staring at the knife beside the crumpled note. She climbed onto his lap, confused. Daddy, are we in trouble? He hesitated before answering, his voice quiet but firm. No, sweetheart, but we might have to go away for a little while. She nodded, trusting him completely. It was that trust that broke his heart more than anything. Later that night, when Ella was asleep, Jack pulled an old metal box from under the floorboard. Inside were a few medals, a faded photo of his wife, and a flash drive sealed in waterproof casing, the last remnant of the operation that had destroyed his life. He turned it over in his hands, feeling the weight of it, not the metal, but the truth it contained. It could bring down powerful men, but it could also destroy the fragile peace he'd built. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He knew what he had to do. Tomorrow night at the docks he would face them, not to surrender but to end it one way or another. He looked over at Ella, sleeping soundly under her blanket, and whispered, You won't grow up in fear, not like this. And as the rain began to fall outside, Jack Turner, once Captain Jack Turner of a forgotten war, prepared to walk back into the darkness he had fled, knowing this time there might be no return. The night arrived heavy and wet, with mist rolling in from the harbor and waves slapping against the worn planks of the old shipping pier. The city lights shimmered faintly across the water, distant and indifferent, while the cranes that once loaded freight now stood as crooked metal skeletons against the moon. Jack Turner parked his rusted sedan 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, the flash drive cold in his jacket pocket. He moved with quiet precision, scanning every shadow, every echo that didn't belong. It was the kind of night where danger breathed softly, patient and expectant. He'd been here before, in different lands under different stars. The smell of salt and oil in the air took him back to memories he wished he could forget. Operations where the line between right and wrong blurred into survival. But tonight was different. Tonight wasn't about orders or missions. It was about ending something that had stolen too much from him already. He stopped at the edge of the main dock and crouched, his eyes sweeping the darkened space ahead. The only light came from a single flickering bulb over a corrugated steel warehouse door. Beyond that, silence, until a low hum of engines reached him. Headlights appeared in the distance, 3 black SUVs pulling in and parking side by side. Men in dark coats stepped out, the kind of men who moved like they'd done this 100 times. Military or ex-intelligence, well-funded and confident. Jack counted at least 8 of them. The lead figure emerged from the middle car, tall and deliberate, his gray hair slicked back and his posture perfectly still. Even at a distance, Jack recognized him instantly. Colonel Damon Reeves, the man who had signed his discharge papers, the man who had ordered the cover-up. Reeves had aged, but his voice still carried the same authority when he spoke. Jack Turner, I was beginning to think you'd finally learned to stay buried. Jack stepped out of the shadows, his boots thudding softly on the soaked planks. You sent someone to my home, he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. You watched my daughter. You broke the one rule that kept me silent. Reeves smiled faintly, his expression smug. Don't be dramatic. We were simply making sure you were still alive. After all, you have something that belongs to us. Jack's gaze didn't waver. You mean the proof that you murdered civilians to protect your career? Reeves's expression hardened slightly. It was necessary. You know how these operations work. Collateral damage. Unfortunate, yes, but it kept the country safe. We both know the world isn't clean, Jack. Someone has to do the dirty work. Jack took another step forward, the mist curling around him like smoke. Someone did, and it wasn't you. Reeves's men shifted slightly, their hands resting near their holsters. Jack noticed, cataloged, measured the space between them and the nearest cover. You were a good soldier, Turner, Reeves said. A damn good one. But you made a mistake. You started believing the lives we protected were worth more than the truth we buried, and that's why you lost everything. Jack's jaw tightened, his voice low. No, I lost everything because you turned me into a ghost to keep your hands clean. For a moment, silence hung between them, thick and electric. Then Reeves raised a hand. One of his men stepped forward, holding out a small black case. Let's make this simple. You hand over the drive and you and your daughter disappear again. Permanently this time. No more watchers, no more threats. You'll be free. Jack's eyes flicked to the case, then back to Reeves. You know, I used to believe men like you couldn't be touched. That power made you untouchable. But the thing about ghosts, Colonel, they don't fear the dark anymore. Reeves's smile faded. This isn't about fear. It's about survival. You have one last chance to walk away with what's left of your life. Jack's hand went to the pocket of his jacket, but not for the drive. Instead, he pulled out a small silver ring, the same one he'd worn for years. He turned it slowly between his fingers, the engraved code glinting in the faint light. You never did figure out what this meant, did you? Reeves frowned. What? Jack looked up, his eyes calm and cold. It's not a code. It's a key. Before Reeves could respond, Jack twisted the ring's inner band and pressed it against his wristwatch. A faint beep sounded, followed by a series of soft, rapid clicks. Then, from somewhere deep in the docks, hidden beneath the warehouse floorboards, a set of small lights blinked to life. Reeves turned sharply, barking, "What did you do?" Jack's voice remained steady. 16 years ago, when I knew they'd come for me, I hid the truth in two places, the drive and a backup link to the signal. The moment it activated, encrypted copies started uploading to multiple international servers. Everything you did, every order you gave, every life you destroyed. By morning, the whole world will know. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then chaos erupted. "Take him!" Reeves shouted. Guns were drawn. Boots thundered across the dock, and Jack dove behind a stack of shipping crates just as bullets ripped through the rain-soaked air. He moved fast, disciplined, efficient. Years of suppressed muscle memory firing into motion. He disarmed one attacker with a brutal twist, used the man's own weapon to drop another, and rolled to cover before the next volley of gunfire chewed through the wood beside him. The sound echoed off the steel containers, sharp and violent, mixing with the howl of the wind and the crash of waves below. Reeves watched from behind his car, his expression tight with anger. "You think this changes anything?" he shouted. "Even if your file leaks, you'll be dead before sunrise." Jack didn't answer. He was already moving, closing the distance with precision born from a lifetime of fighting wars that didn't officially exist. Another man lunged around the corner. Jack caught him with a sharp elbow to the throat and sent him sprawling into the water. Two more closed in from behind, but Jack anticipated them, knocking one's weapon aside and slamming the other into a metal beam. His breath came in short, controlled bursts, his body moving like a machine programmed for survival. But then a new sound cut through the storm. A faint, terrified voice. "Daddy!" Jack froze. His head snapped toward the warehouse entrance. There, half in shadow, stood Ella, barefoot and trembling, her small hands clutching the doorframe. Behind her, a man in a suit held her arm tightly, his gun pressed to her shoulder. Reeves stepped forward, his face illuminated by the headlights. "I told you, Jack, everyone has leverage. Now you're going to hand me that drive before I count to 3. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, a cold dread spreading through him. He'd planned for almost everything, but not this. Ella's wide eyes locked onto his, full of confusion and fear. He raised a hand slowly. "Let her go, Reeves. This is between you and me." Reeves smirked. "You know how this works. Give me the drive or she dies." "You've got 10 seconds, Jack's mind raced. 10 seconds. Too far to close the gap. Too exposed for a clean shot. He needed a distraction, something, anything, to shift the balance. Then, almost imperceptibly, he saw it. A faint red dot sliding across the dock, settling on the gunman's chest. A moment later, a muffled shot cracked through the rain and the man dropped instantly. Jack turned, shocked, to see Isabella Lane standing in the shadows behind a parked truck, her hand steady on a suppressed pistol. Her voice echoed across the dock, cold and clear. "You should have left him alone, Colonel." Reeves spun, firing in her direction, but Jack was already moving. He charged, tackling Reeves to the ground. The two men struggled, the gun skidding across the slick boards. Reeves landed a blow to Jack's ribs. Jack countered with a strike to his throat, then pinned him down. "You destroyed everything," Reeves gasped, blood on his lip. "You think this will make you a hero?" Jack's eyes burned with fury. "No, it just makes you accountable." He pressed the drive into Reeves's chest, leaning close. "And that's worse for men like you." Before Reeves could respond, sirens wailed in the distance, police or maybe federal agents. Jack stood, pulling Ella into his arms as Isabella approached, rain dripping from her hair. "They'll come after us both now," she said quietly. Jack shook his head. "No, the evidence is already out. By the time they arrive, Reeves and his friends will be the ones running." The colonel lay on the dock, defeated, staring up at the storm as flashing lights began to illuminate the fog. His empire, built on silence and fear, was crumbling before his eyes. He tried to speak, but the words died on his tongue. Jack turned to Isabella. "You didn't have to come." She met his gaze steadily. "Yes, I did. You saved me once. It was time I returned the favor." As the first police cars pulled in, Jack tightened his hold on Ella. For the first time in years, the weight he carried began to lift, not completely, but enough to breathe. He looked down at his daughter, who was clutching his jacket tightly, her voice trembling. "Are we safe now, Daddy?" He smiled faintly. "We will be." Behind them, the dock burned with blue and red light, the rain washing away the blood and the secrets both. Jack glanced once more at the horizon, at the faint glow of dawn beginning to break, and thought of all the years he'd spent hiding in the shadows. Tonight, those shadows had finally released him. He wasn't invisible anymore.